This lake trout made him the third contestant this season to consume protein. The hard-earned food was taken back to the shelter. Dwayne intended to grill the fish, but struggled with his fire-making skills. After 2 hours of trying, he failed to get a fire going. Frustrated and unable to bear the hunger, Dwayne considered eating the raw fish. Fortunately, the trout had few parasites and was quite fresh, though a bit fishy. That night, Michael was terribly nauseated. He felt a buzzing on his head, and upon checking his hat, found a fly had nested and laid eggs inside it. Michael had to use tweezers to remove the maggots one by one. The next day, he decided to improve his personal hygiene using his backpack's rain cover as a makeshift bathtub, filling it with lake water. He then heated up a fire, warmed stones in it, and placed them in the bathtub to heat the water for a comfortable bath. Personal hygiene is easier to manage for male contestants. Female contestants face more challenges, such as Kate, whose toilet paper ran out on day 10. Luckily, she found soft dogwood leaves that felt almost like toilet paper. She planned to stock up on them. Additionally, she discovered a plant whose leaves contained a chemical that, when crushed, acted like soap nuts. Kate experimented by the river and successfully created foam by rubbing the leaves. On the 10th day, Dwayne seemed melancholic, possibly from eating too much raw fish. He then carved intricate patterns of flowing streams, rolling mountains, and free-swimming fish, along with himself on his axe handle, marking his wilderness solitude. He pondered the essence of loneliness. Back home, each family member has their spirit bird. His wife's is a crow. Having not seen a crow throughout the competition, he took it as a sign when one flew over his campsite today. Believing it was a message from his wife, he decided to withdraw from the competition. The kayak built by the expert is finally completed. Mike, after several busy days, is eager for its maiden voyage. He brings the kayak to the shore and stuffs all his gear into it. With the preparations complete and his carefully made paddle in hand, Mike cautiously sits in the kayak. To his surprise, it turns out to be a bit small. Even a simple leg movement takes effort. Once everything is ready, Mike paddles forward, but in the next second, the kayak capsizes, causing an embarrassing situation. After 10 days of hard work, the result is disappointing. Fortunately, it isn't winter. Otherwise, a fall into the water would mean dropping out of the race. Currently, Chris has gathered the most food, allowing him to leisurely sing in the shelter. Today's plan is to catch some crayfish in the forest after discovering a stream there, which is ideal for crayfish. Catching them is easy with a bit of bait, as crayfish cling to it unless pulled out of the water. However, despite waiting, Chris sees no crayfish, guessing either the bait isn't enticing enough or the crayfish are too timid. Ultimately, he tries reaching for them with his hands but ends up empty-handed. Returning to the shelter, Chris feels despondent. Just then, a helicopter flies overhead, triggering Chris's anxiety. He served in Iraq, where his tent was near a helipad, and he suffers from PTSD. The sound of the helicopter overwhelms him emotionally. He worries about other contestants being injured and finds himself in tears amid a wave of panic. The helicopter lingers, prolonging his distress until he gradually recovers. It's been 6 months since his last episode, but the stress of the competition and the helicopter might have triggered a relapse. His PTSD poses a significant risk that could lead to a breakdown during the show. Kate had a rough night with noises near her tent. As a wildlife biologist, she suspects small animals like possums or wallabies are responsible, driven by professional curiosity rather than a desire to hunt them. She finds a trail behind the camp, leading to droppings between 2 trees, larger ones likely from a wallaby and smaller from a possum. She studies them closely, concluding that this is what wildlife biologists do. Back at the shelter, Kate isn't interested in hunting, even if it costs her the championship. On the 10th day, Gina finally starts looking for food as her weight drops by 1 kilogram a day. Needing food, she opts for carbohydrates and finds sagebrush near her camp. Its roots are starch-rich, so she collects a bunch, washes and chops them, then simmers them on low heat. However, instead of turning into a paste, she ends up with root soup, which tastes awful even after adding salt. Worse, drinking salt water on an empty stomach causes her to vomit, highlighting the risks of such an action. Last night, Kate finally met her neighbor as she had suspected. It was indeed several possums. This time, 3 appeared at once, and Kate thought they might be a family. She had initially thought possums were just large rats, but found them quite cute. After greeting her neighbor, Kate felt completely satisfied, and the possum family reminded her of her own family. She wished her 2 children were also there with her. Michael also encountered the possums that night, but unlike Kate, he is no wildlife biologist. Hearing noises, Michael's first thought was that it was food. He quickly grabbed his equipment to catch the possums. However, the possums were clever. Seeing Michael, they immediately kept quiet, and he returned to his shelter empty-handed. Just as he lay down to rest, the possums started making noise again. It seemed they didn't like their neighbor Michael and were trying to drive him away. After several disturbances through the night, he finally made it to dawn. For a quieter sleep in the future and to catch some game to fill his stomach, Michael planned to make a trap. His plan was to build a box with a lid and set up an ambush in a spot the possums frequented. It was not difficult to find materials in the rainforest. Soon Michael had collected a pile of logs. He then went to the slope behind his shelter and observed the terrain, noting that animals would pass there to drink water. Michael then started building the trap by driving stakes into the ground. After yesterday's kayak flipping incident, Mike did not lose faith in his kayak. He checked for leaks and found that a piece of the rain cover was below the water level. By slightly raising the seam, he fixed the problem. After repairing the kayak, Mike planned to go back on the water. He paddled and felt much better than last time, gaining confidence and speeding up. After much effort over several days, he finally began his fishing venture in the middle of the lake. After a day's rest, Chris finally recovered from his stress disorder. Arriving at the lake, he noticed his fishing rod moving.
There's the bite. Come on, come on, come on, come on, come on. Yes, 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 yes. Yeah! Yeah! Woohoo! We're having trout for breakfast. Insanely tough and challenging and absolute paradise.
After tidying up the shelter, Kate went back to the forest. She took out a shovel and quickly unearthed several large, fat worms. Kate then placed the worms in a tin can. They were just her fishing bait. No wonder Kate always managed to catch eels with such big, lively bait. However, Chris's mental state finally collapsed. Although he tried to recover from his stress disorder, the lack of food and the excitement of helicopters deepened his self-doubt. Even the perfect scenery of Tasmania, like a wonderland from Alice's dreams, could not keep him interested. Rather than continue to struggle, Chris decisively called the program team.
I feel like I'm not going to regret leaving today. Now's the time. I guess realising that there's still a lot of work to go. And it was great. I was loving it. I definitely need people in my life. Hopefully I've inspired at least one person.
Mike's boat building and fishing plans were unsuccessful. To date, he had not caught any protein, despite his efforts. He had the season's best fishing rod, and had built the most complex trap of the season, and spent a lot of time building his kayak. Yet, he still caught nothing, feeling like a student with lots of supplies, but poor results. Now that his boating and fishing were hindered, Mike decided to refocus on the trap, hoping to catch a possum for a substantial meal. Unfortunately, the trap on the mountain still had no game. Mike checked the camera again. The little kangaroo that appeared last time came to the trap again, but no matter how much the kangaroo fussed, the trap was not triggered. Frustrated by the ineffective trap, Mike laughed. He didn't understand why the tripwire wasn't working. He then returned to the shelter to get a backpack, planning to simulate the kangaroo's movement to figure out why the trap wasn't triggered. The result was rather strange. It was as if the kangaroo had the ability to phase through walls. Kate brought worms to the shore to start fishing despite the chilly 8-degree weather and light rain. The lure of food kept her fishing in the rain. Soon there was a stir, and she caught another eel, even bigger than the last. Kate quickly took it to a stump for processing. Facing this hard-earned protein, she wasted no time. She skinned and gutted it smoothly.
Woo, eel skin. Okay. Yeah, baby. It's all really good fats and protein for me.
Then started a wilderness mukbang at the camp. Day 15 was routine medical checkup day, and the medical team arrived early at Mike's camp. After a thorough examination, they found Mike had low blood pressure and had lost 11.7% of his body weight in 2 weeks. When asked about his recent diet, Mike was so embarrassed he wished he could disappear. He had been starving. On day 2, Mike checked his trap again. This time it had been triggered, but sadly, still no prey. He checked the camera and saw a possum that had easily sabotaged the trap. If not for the footage, Mike would have thought the possum was enchanted. Gina's attempt at making root vegetable soup was unsuccessful, causing her to vomit for hours. She acknowledged the need for real food. After greeting a platypus by the river in the morning, Gina headed into the mountains equipped for foraging, planning to stay for 90 days. Unaware she had made it to the semi-finals, Gina would have been thrilled. Back home, she knew of a fern rich in starch, tasting like potatoes. It took climbing 2 mountains to find it. She skillfully stripped the leaves and chopped the roots, eagerly cooking a big pot back at the shelter. 2 hours later, Gina shook her head in disappointment. The caloric output surpassed the intake. She realized she needed to focus on obtaining proteins and fats. Michael's trap, essentially a cage made of branches with a small mechanism at the entrance, was finally complete. It looked less effective than Mike's, and without any bait, it was uncertain if it would catch anything. The competition reached day 20. Gina spent the morning watching her fishing line by the river with no bites. A large bird passing by seemed a good omen, so she changed her fishing spot in the afternoon. Soon, her line began to shake violently, and she caught a large trout, her first protein since the competition began. Back at the shelter, she fried the fish, seasoning it lightly, making the neighboring men envious. Boat expert Mike also switched to fishing, setting up several lines, but had no luck until one line tightened. He struggled to secure the very slippery eel, and just as he was about to use his knife, the eel escaped, leaving Mike heartbroken. Kate starts her morning with routine breathing exercises to cleanse her spirit, followed by cleansing her body. She strips off her clothes and jumps into the cold water, which is only 8 degrees Celsius. Since obtaining an eel yesterday, Gina's vitality has reached a new level. She lifted a large patch of moss in front of the camp, initially thought to be used to reinforce the shelter. However, she suddenly started collecting earthworms, putting them into her boots. She collected over a dozen before returning to the shelter. Gina learned that many animals enjoy eating earthworms because they are rich in protein. Coincidentally, protein was exactly what Gina was lacking. She boldly thought of cooking the earthworms on a hot plate to see if they could sustain her. If her plan worked, the open ground outside could provide a continuous source of protein. She fried the earthworms until golden brown on both sides, tasted one, and found the flavor acceptable despite a slight earthy taste. Meanwhile, Michael's ongoing battle with a possum continues. He checked the traps in the woods today but found nothing. However, he noticed the trapdoor had been triggered and checked the tracking camera. Like a neighbor who faced a similar challenge, the possum had triggered the trap but did not enter the cage. Disappointed, he returned to the shelter with no gains. It was puzzling how he had survived over 20 days, which remained a mystery until today. It turns out that Michael had been eating river grass, rich in dietary fiber and vitamin C, which, despite its poor taste and low calories, kept him from starving. The psychological pressure of not finding food was immense, making him often think of his family. Without a miracle, his withdrawal from the competition seemed imminent. Kate, reflecting on her life, seemed to have found some answers. Today, the 22nd day of the competition, holds special significance for her since her mother's favorite number was also 22. Her mother passed away at 46, having always wanted to visit South America but never making it there. Kate often wished her mother were still alive, as she would have been a wonderful grandmother. With no need for the competition's $250,000 prize for living, Kate's goal was to return home and be a good mother. Having realized this, she called the show's producers and withdrew from the competition without regrets. Today, Gina caught another big fish, her third in as many days, overshadowing the 2 male competitors. She made a pot of fish soup with the fish head and cartilage, which left her profoundly satisfied. Given her progress, winning the championship seemed almost certain by day 23. Mike was nearby, overturning decayed wood in search of bait to continue his fishing. After much effort with no sight of bait, he felt nearly defeated and sat by the river for a long time. He later found a new spot with plenty of earthworms and secured 5 fishing lines, then sat by the shore to monitor them, as the competition rules required to prevent accidental harm to protected animals. At 10 p.m., one of the lines moved. He cautiously approached, mindful of his previous experiences with eels escaping. This fish was too important to lose, so Mike decided to strip down and retrieve it from the water. Finally, with the help of a net, the eel was successfully captured. After 23 days, Mike finally caught some protein. Desperate with hunger, Mike didn't care what time it was and devoured the eel overnight.
Wow, what an amazing fish. Whew. Wow.
Now, Michael is the one suffering. He's been surviving on seaweed, and over the 23 days, he's lost 20 kilograms. He wonders if it's still worth continuing the competition. Initially, his aim to win $250,000 wasn't for himself. He and his wife started a welfare school in Congo. The prize money would cover a year and a half of staff salaries. It turns out Michael is a real philanthropist. Hopefully, he wins in the end. On day 24, Gina was drawn to the water by a flapping noise. At first, she thought a platypus got tangled in the fishing line, but it was another trout on the hook.
Excuse me for a minute, because I've got to do this. I really feel like this land is just looking after me.
Since catching the eel yesterday, Mike seemed unstoppable. The next morning, he caught another eel, skinned it, and removed its guts. However, he didn't rush to eat this one. Eels have 5 to 6 times more fat than regular fish. Mike was too full from last night's meal and kept burping. Eating now could cause vomiting, which would be a loss. To enhance the eel's flavor, Mike decided against boiling it. Boiled eel was too greasy. He skillfully stripped bark from a stump, shaped it into a cylinder, and hung it over a fire. It seems he planned to smoke the eel. It was ready by nightfall.
Yes. That is magical.
Yum. It's just like greasy and fatty.
Has to be fresh worms, and I've learned how to get the fresh worms, so fortunes have changed.
Remembering the fishing line stuck in the water days ago, Mike thought a big eel might be the cause. Given the food shortage, he considered diving in despite the risks. Humans can become exhausted and lose consciousness in water below 15 degrees Celsius within 30 minutes, and the water was even colder. Going in was practically risking his life. Fed up with being hungry all day, Mike decided to dive. Following the line, he reached a deep area where he suddenly sank. He emerged empty-handed, the fishing line tangled in underwater debris. Seeing the risks, Mike reluctantly swam back. After this lesson, he vowed never to set hooks in that area again. Michael moved to a new area he discovered days ago, noting kangaroo tracks and cleaner water. He believed his current plight was due to the poor resources of his initial campsite. Indeed, one can't survive on barren land. So, Michael planned to move, a huge task given his weakened state. He thought the old camp had no hope left, and continuing meant likely withdrawal from the competition. Sometimes a change in direction could lead to better prospects. At worst, he'd return home empty-handed. However, Michael underestimated the difficulty of moving. The first trip, carrying only camera gear and a backpack, exhausted all his energy. He feared Michael might quit after moving. The camera shifts to Gina's side. Due to the rule that one must watch the fishing line, Gina stays up until it's completely dark without sleeping, waiting for a fish to bite. Unexpectedly, it starts to rain after a while. She decides to pull in the line and go to sleep. Braving the dark and rain, Gina heads to the water's edge. Just when she is about to give up, she catches a fish unexpectedly, her 7th recent catch. If the 2 male competitors next door knew, they would probably be jealous. Gina wonders why fate seems so unfair. On the 27th day of the competition, 3 days have passed since Mike last had fish. Whether he has had any other catches can be guessed from his expression. Following the old saying, "A rolling stone gathers no moss," Mike plans to check the other side of the river. However, with dark clouds and gusty winds, crossing the river in a kayak is risky. The irregular airflow could send the kayak drifting erratically. Nevertheless, the wind doesn't stop by afternoon, nor does it worsen, so Mike decides to take the risk. If the opposite shore has abundant resources, he could thrive. Upon reaching the western bank, he finds a clean pond and starts fishing. But fate plays tricks again. It starts raining not long after he begins. Staying warm is crucial for survival in the wild, so Mike has no choice but to paddle back. With no food in his stomach, the round trip consumes a significant amount of calories. This venture has taken a severe toll. Gina fried a fish for breakfast in the morning, living a seemingly enchanted life that the neighboring competitors can only envy. To date, Gina is the only contestant who has escaped the pangs of hunger. With a daily intake of 1 kilogram of protein, it's believable she could last until the production company goes bankrupt. However, this inevitably leads to cliched introspection. Initially, Gina said loneliness had no impact on her. She had a platypus as a neighbor and birds as friends, asserting that being without humans didn't equate to loneliness. Now, she is curious about how the other contestants are doing and how many remain in competition with her. Her admission of these thoughts indicates she's beginning to feel the solitude. Soon enough, Gina expresses a wish for someone to be there to give her a gentle hug and to look into her eyes and say, "I need you." Michael's relocation efforts continue, costing him many calories. But looking at the environment, the clear stream, and the aquatic plants, he feels hopeful. Fishing here could sustain him. He clears a small area and sets up a rain shelter. Tonight, he plans to camp here. Since crossing the river, Mike has become much more cautious. His strategy is to stay put unless absolutely necessary, even if it means surviving like Juan to the very end. His daily routine involves watching the fishing line at the campsite. As dusk approaches, the line finally shows signs of activity. Mike quickly grabs his net. After 4 hungry days, he finally catches a fish. Thinking of his neighbor Michael, it seems this season's championship could be a contest between Mike and Gina. On the morning of day 28, Michael is busy packing up the camp. Due to the tight schedule yesterday, he didn't set up his bed and ended up with a sore back. Today, after finishing his packing, he plans to rest all day in bed, conserving energy while actively looking for food. This competition is a rare opportunity for Michael, but it comes at a cost to himself and his family. Later, Michael starts a heartfelt confession to his family in front of the camera. However, he breaks down crying. Surviving in the wild has been extremely difficult. Given Michael's situation, withdrawing from the competition seems to be his next step. Michael noticed frost at the competition site early in the morning. This was definitely bad news for the contestants. Lower temperatures meant harder access to food and quicker energy loss. Fortunately, Michael had completed his moving project. He hoped to sustain himself by fishing in the area, using a small tree as a fishing rod, and thus began his fishing endeavor. However, Tasmanian weather seemed to conspire against him as it started to drizzle shortly. Michael had no choice but to return to his shelter in despair. By day 31, it was time for a routine medical checkup. The 2 male contestants were nervous about it, fully aware of their condition. Losing weight rapidly due to lack of food, they risked being advised to leave the show if they failed the medical exam. To avoid this, both men drank a lot of water before the medical team's arrival to maintain their weight. Fortunately, they both passed the checkup. Mike found it hard to believe and was curious to see how much he had slimmed down. Taking advantage of the warm noon, he undressed to check his body, finding his once plump belly now wrinkled. He estimated that the 19 kilograms he had gained before the competition were likely depleted. Mike felt that without finding food soon, the medical team would not allow him another 30 days unless he caught fish or game. Speaking of fishing, he thought using worms would be best, so he went to the forest to look for them. Yet today, the worms seemed to be playing hide and seek, and he couldn't find any. The reason was obvious. As mentioned earlier, the competition site had experienced frost, driving the worms deeper into the ground to avoid the freeze. Digging deeper in the usual spots would surely yield worms. After the medical team left, Michael felt crushed. He almost wished they had disqualified him, so he could go home without struggling over whether to quit. From day 1, he had been starving, dealing with both physical decline and immense mental pressure. He knew his performance would likely be mocked when the show aired, making him look like a clown. After much thought, Michael decided to quit voluntarily. Following his departure, only Gina and Mike remained, marking the official entry into the final stage of the Wilderness Alone Australia competition. Given the current situation, Gina winning seemed almost certain. However, even she couldn't prevent losing weight as the weather grew colder. She considered changing her survival strategy, starting with upgrading the shelter's door curtain. She constructed a frame from branches, filled it with bushes, and placed it at the entrance to block the cold air. After finishing, she was a bit hungry and reheated some fish soup from 2 days prior. Unfortunately, it tasted sour, likely spoiled. At such a critical moment in the competition, even with food scarcity, she couldn't risk eating spoiled food, as it could lead to vomiting or gastroenteritis, wiping out all her advantages. Despite her caution, Gina still suffered from diarrhea at night. While dealing with it, a dark figure suddenly darted beside her, scaring her tremendously. Acting on instinct, Gina grabbed a stick and struck the dark figure. To her surprise, the figure lay motionless on the ground after being hit. When she turned on her headlamp for a better look, she froze. It was a small kangaroo. Desperate for food, this unexpected prey seemed like a gift from heaven. Surely, winning the competition without making use of such a gift would be unthinkable. The valuable protein source meant skinning and gutting the kangaroo immediately, followed by preparing a meal on a hot plate. After days of hunger, this meal revitalized Gina. In stark contrast, Mike was having a much harder time. His attempts at fishing were unsuccessful, and possums teased him daily, eluding every trap he set. Disappointed with his original traps, Mike planned a new, larger net, swearing to capture the elusive possum. Learning from past failures, he designed a net that would fall from above and was more sensitive than the previous one. The effectiveness of this new trap remained to be seen. That night, Mike heard the trap trigger and quickly checked with his headlamp, only to find the trap empty again. Reviewing the surveillance camera footage, he saw the possum dodge the net at the last second. Frustrated, Mike didn't bother packing up the trap and went back to sleep in his shelter. If he knew that Gina had managed to knock down a kangaroo with just a stick, it would probably make him want to quit the competition. Feeling incredibly down, Mike looked at his family photo, something he had avoided since starting the competition. He knew that reminiscing about home could lead to him quitting, but the consecutive setbacks left him needing comfort from the sight of his wife and children. The next morning, Gina processed the kangaroo, expertly shaving off the meat, which she then cut into fine strips, salted, and hung over the fire to roast. She estimated the kangaroo could yield about 5 kilograms of protein, enough to sustain her for another half-month. She wasted none of the kangaroo, roasting the bones on the fire and eagerly eating them. Since day 30, Mike had not caught anything, and hunger had visibly changed his appearance. Despite this, he decided to reset his traps, if only for psychological comfort. Surprisingly, while resetting the traps, he found 2 earthworms and hurriedly used them as bait for fishing. That evening, a fish finally bit, providing Mike with much-needed sustenance just as he was about to give up. On day 51 of the competition, Mike made a cake from mud and decorated it with green plants, then created fireworks with a fire stick. It was his son Tom's 14th birthday, and Mike celebrated this special day, also celebrating his own recent catch. Fortuitously, he had caught 4 fish the previous night. After processing the fish, his shelter looked more bountiful than a holiday feast. With his spirits lifted by the abundance of food, Mike felt he could continue competing for several more days. Even with Gina's kangaroo meat, it was uncertain who could last longer. Gina's kangaroo meat had dwindled after a few days of consumption. Recently, she cooked it with eel in a mixed stew to save food. Even so, the remaining meat would last at most 1 more week. Considering the future, Gina decided to supplement her diet with green vegetables for more variety and balanced nutrition. She went to a spot where she previously gathered berries, only to find it now occupied by a venomous snake. Gina was understandably alarmed, but seeing the snake as potential food, she decided to take a risk. Unfortunately, she had left her axe at home and lacked any suitable tools. Moreover, the snake was highly alert. Gina then planned to subdue it with a stick. While searching for a stick, she realized the snake was a highly venomous tiger snake, ranked 4th worldwide. Realizing the danger of a potential bite, she hurried back to her shelter. By day 55, the time had passed quickly due to continuous storms with strong winds. Mike struggled to keep his shelter secured during the weather. Gina's situation wasn't much better. The rain kept her confined, making hunting or fishing impossible. However, her shelter was sturdier than Mike's. The downside was her lack of a sleeping bag, forcing her to modify the fireplace for warmth at night. On day 58, Mike was distressed when he detected a strange smell at night and discovered some of his fish had spoiled. He reluctantly cut off the spoiled parts and stewed them again, despite the risks. By day 59, fortunately, Mike had no adverse effects from the fish, but his fish supply was nearly gone, with the last one lasting only 2.5 more days. The low water levels made fishing increasingly difficult, forcing him to reduce his food portions. By day 61, Mike had only one piece of fish left. After finishing it, he even licked the pot lid, knowing the survival challenge had escalated. Day 64 marked a special occasion as it was Mike's birthday and the routine medical checkup by the show's crew. By then, Mike had lost 25% of his initial body weight, had no body fat, and very low blood pressure. When he was informed of his elimination, he was not overly upset, but relieved that the ordeal was over. Although he did not win, he felt satisfied with his efforts and looked forward to seeing his family. The winner of the first season of Alone in Australia was announced, and it was Gina, the series' first female champion. Unknown to her at the time, the crew planned to bring her family to her and pretend to conduct a medical checkup. Her family would surprise her by appearing behind her unexpectedly.
What the fuck?
Yeah.